Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening to the Quality Hub, chatting with ISO experts. I'm your host, Xavier Francis, and today I'm here again with Norm Verbeck, consultant at Core Business Solutions. Glad you could join us again, Norm.
Glad to be here, Xavier.
Always a pleasure to have you. I think this is your third or fourth time, and always get great information from you. On this week's podcast, we're going to be discussing design and development. But before we begin, let's hear a little bit more about Norm and his journey and experience. Norm?
Sure. So my name is Norm Verbeck. I've been with Core Solutions as a consultant for a little bit over 3 years. But my previous experience, primarily in quality management and actually manufacturing operations. Within 2 large manufacturing companies, I worked in the printing industry for about 15 years and 5 years in door manufacturing.
Oh, wow. That's great. Well, it's wonderful to have you here again. I know you've been absolutely fabulous on previous podcasts, so it's great to have you here again. So let's get started with me reading Clause 8.3.1, which is for design and development. The organization shall establish, implement, and maintain a design and development process that is appropriate to ensure the subsequent provisions of products and services. Can you explain a little bit to us what that means?
Sure. So for an organization that designs a product or service, the company must determine a process to follow based on how your company designs products or services.
Okay.
Although some designs do not always have the same requirements to go through the exact same process, a general plan should be followed and documented.
All right. So putting a written or documented plan in place is kind of what we're doing.
Correct. There are many organizations that might consider Clause 8.3 in the ISO standard as not applicable based on their operations, as they primarily are just fulfilling customer requirements with no design being performed.
Okay.
So there are a few questions that you can ask yourself to determine if you truly are involved with design activities.
All right. What might those be?
So one of the questions would be, are there any products being produced that are protected by maybe patents?
Okay.
For example. Maybe customers have only given you some vague performance requirements, but not really any detailed specifications. Then they might expect you to provide a product or services that's going to meet their requirements generally that they're giving you.
This is what we needed to do. You're going to figure out how to make it do that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then is your company creative and innovative? So are you kind of a startup potentially? Are you providing a solution maybe in an emerging market?
Okay.
And a final one might be, are you producing a unique product or service for a customer that hasn't really provided you those exact specifications? So it doesn't, particular size, particular functionality. They kind of have those general ideas for what they might want it to do, but they haven't really provided you any detailed specifications.
Okay.
And
so we want a fizzy soda that tastes sort of like a cola.
Exactly.
All right.
Yep.
We got to do some R&D to figure out what that is.
Yep. Or the traditional example is, you think of like just a, general sketch on like a bar napkin.
Yeah.
Where, somebody's kind of brainstorming and they have an idea and, they're giving you to kind of, how can we go about designing and putting this into reality? So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if any of those questions are yes, then you do have to consider that you're doing design and development?
Most likely, yes.
Okay. All right. So how do we here at Core approach Clause 8.3 of ISO 9001?
So at Core, we utilize a document or kind of like project management tool that we call the design plan and schedule. So it's primarily a template that's used to document all designs in a way that, if it's used correctly, will help control and standardize your design process. And at the same time, it helps make sure that you're satisfying all the ISO requirements that they're looking for.
And that's going to be in our resource library?
That's one of our auto forms.
Okay, that's one of our auto forms. Okay.
Yep. So ISO, they define design and development as a set of processes that take requirements for a product or service and then turn those requirements into more detailed requirements.
So the requirements for the requirements?
Yes. So it's really kind of clarifying and actually mapping those out to what the requirements specifically are. So that means that the result or the output of a design process is not necessarily a product, but it's a design.
Okay.
It's instructions, drawings, documents, maybe acceptance criteria, could be scripts for service providers. If you're designing some training or if you're designing maybe somebody's kind of document control system, you could be designing a number of different things that aren't necessarily a tangible physical product, but for service companies, it could be something that's more a little bit less tangible.
Right.
than
And
something
but
physical.
even if it is a manufacturing, you aren't ending with a product, you're ending with a source of requirements for that product.
Yes.
Okay.
And you'll eventually, based on those designs, you're going to actually develop some prototypes
Right.
and things that you'll be able to test for both verification that it meets requirements and then eventually what they call validation, which are those functioning as they're intended to.
Okay.
So
Awesome.
there is a difference between what you consider design and the word development. So for the purposes of the ISO standard, design and development are considered a set of activities, and all these activities need to fulfill the requirements no matter what they're referred to within a company.
Okay. So moving on, what criteria, or you mentioned outputs, but what are the criteria or inputs that can be considered to ensure final results meet the needs of the user or goals of the project?
So depending on the company, there's a wide range of criteria or inputs that could be considered to ensure that final results are met and that they're meeting the needs of the users or goals of the project.
Okay.
So some of those user needs and requirements, it's important to understand the needs, preferences, and pain points of the target users. That's a critical point.
Okay.
This may involve conducting user research, interviews, surveys, usability testing, primarily gathering insights from the people that are going to use it.
Gotcha.
You might conduct a market analysis, so assessing the competitive landscape, maybe some market trends, customer behavior. That all helps in identifying opportunities and then maybe positioning of the product or service eventually whenever you're going to introduce it to the market.
So maybe one reason you might do that is, let's say we're looking at shoes and you want them to be extremely comfortable. You can look at other competitive people that have already made something and say, hey, this is comfortable, this is not.
Absolutely.
And gain some information from there.
Yep. Looking at business objectives. So that's something else we want to make sure aligning the design and development process with the overarching goals of the business. And then, you might be looking at certain revenue targets, maybe market expansion or brand positioning.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you definitely have to make sure that what you're making and what you're designing is with your true north, your true goals and strategy of your business.
Absolutely. You also look at technology and feasibility. So evaluating technological feasibility of the proposed solution, considering factors like available resources, time constraints, and even technical expertise.
Yeah, I could see that.
Stakeholder input. Primarily, this is where we're looking to gather input and feedback from various stakeholders. This could include executive investors, customers, internal teams. And primarily, we're looking to ensure that we're in alignment and there's a collaboration throughout the process.
Okay.
Another important piece could be regulatory and compliance requirements. So we want to make sure we're understanding and adhering to any relevant regulations, standards that you need to follow, potentially industry guidelines. And primarily, again, we want to make sure we're in alignment with legal compliance and potentially even mitigating risks in those areas.
I totally understand that. Could that also apply to copyright issue? Let's say you're getting in a market that stuff's already been developed.
Absolutely.
Okay. And that could be a major risk.
Yes, absolutely.
So you want to make sure you mitigate that risk that you're not copying somebody else's product.
That is correct. Sustainability and ethical considerations. So incorporating principles of sustainability, environmental responsibility, ethical considerations into whatever you're designing and developing. So really kind of having that as a piece of your process as well. So think about like the end of life cycle for, something related to like electronics that you're developing. So we want to kind of take into consideration, what do we need to do to dispose of those properly?
Right.
Eventually,
or from the flip, on the other end, where do we get our raw materials?
Exactly.
Is it from an ethical place?
Yes.
That's not dealing with bad labor and stuff like that.
Yep. So you can also look at user experience design principles. This is applying principles of UX design to create intuitive, accessible, and engaging experiences for users across different techniques and touch points.
Okay.
So we kind of talked about brand identity and positioning as well, but we want to ensure consistency with the brand's identity, values, messaging, just to maintain brand integrity and then resonate with that target audience.
Right. Again, what if it's something new and you're trying to branch out? You still want to make sure that you're not losing your identity, but it's more of a growth versus a change, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
We look into prototyping and iteration. So we want to when we're doing prototyping, testing, refining the product or service based on user feedback and performance, that's going to help us to achieve a continuous improvement if we're trying to continually improve that design.
Gotcha.
And then one of the final ones would be kind of making sure we consider criteria and inputs holistically. So products and services that can be provided that are not only functional, but also user-centered, market-aligned, and like I mentioned, sustainable from an ethical standpoint.
Wow. That is a lot to consider in your design and development of things.
It is.
And it's probably why 9000 sets this requirement, because of those things. What do we have to take into consideration as we're doing this before we even put a plan together to make something? With that in mind, what are controls that are often common to put in place?
So controls, they're essential when we ensure quality, efficiency, effectiveness, and there's a number of those as well. So one of the most common ones at the very beginning is we want to think about change management.
Okay.
So we want to make sure we establish a formal process for managing changes to design requirements, scope, specifications, and this could include documentation, maybe an impact assessment, could be some approval workflows, and even communication to the stakeholders.
Well, that's really important, because what do you do when a change happens? For whatever reason, how do you manage that? Who makes the decisions? How do you go back and look at things before you even get to the point of how do we make the change?
Absolutely.
That's really important.
Risk management, that's another important area. So we want to identify, assess, and mitigate risks that are associated with the design and development activities that are going on. So this could be technical risks, maybe schedule risks with meeting a deadline. There might be resource constraints, compliance risks, which we talked about a little bit already. And this primarily minimize potential negative impacts on those project outcomes. Another area would be configuration management. So this is implementing procedures to help control and track changes to software, hardware. There could be other configuration items throughout the development lifecycle, but we really want to make sure we ensure consistency, integrity, and then traceability of those configurations. Testing and validation controls is another area. So we want to make sure we establish procedures for testing, verification, and validation of designs and prototypes to ensure they meet specified requirements, functionality, and performance criteria before we release or deploy it.
Right.
And those are two terms that sometimes there's a little bit of confusion whenever you talk about design and development, at least it's in the eyes of the standard.
Okay.
So those two terms sound very synonymous: verification, validation. So verification's primarily where we're actually kind of looking at the attributes, correct size, right color, if it's a physical product. So there could be certain attributes. Whenever we verify, we make sure it meets those attributes. Where validation is where we're actually testing to see if it's actually functioning as intended.
Okay, so let's take a shoe or a sneaker, for instance. It's the right color, it has the right flare to it, it has that type of stuff, but does it function when somebody's using it to run?
Yes. Yep. And you might validate that to see how long they last. So, are they, meeting, do they validate to, maybe the intended lifetime, is there so many steps or how long that tread's going to last on a shoe in that example.
Okay.
And really with those controls, there's a number of different ways you can validate or even verify. Verify is fairly straightforward. It's, more like I mentioned, the attributes, but the validation could be a number of different things.
Yeah,
so.
You have to look how things function from, like you said, wear, comfort. Does it help somebody if it's supposed to relieve pressure in certain points or whatever if we're dealing with the shoe? All that stuff. And there's multiple ways you're going to have to test all that.
Absolutely. We also would look at peer review and quality assurance. So conducting peer reviews, maybe code reviews, and quality assurance activities to identify defects, maybe inconsistency, even opportunities for improvement. So we try to do that early in the design development process. So that'll help us to reduce rework and enhancing overall quality right out of the gate.
I can see that.
And then one of the final areas is even considering supplier and vendor management. So if we establish criteria for selecting, evaluating, monitoring suppliers and vendors that are involved in providing components, materials, or services for design and development activities, that'll help us to ensure quality, reliability, and then at the end of the day, compliance with requirements.
Okay. So not just looking at it from a perspective of, this is where we're going to go to raw materials, but maybe somebody makes something that is used as part of that.
Absolutely.
Maybe let's say with a shoe, we're doing with the tread, they make the material. You're not making that material. You're just utilizing it and cutting it into form or whatever, making sure that they can do that to your specs
Yes.
and everything. Make sure that we know how the longevity of it, those types of things. You're managing that. And if not, who might we have if they don't? Maybe a backup.
Yes.
Do we have more than one supplier if we need to?
Yes. And that's part of that risk that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to necessarily have raw materials that are coming from a sole source supplier, because if that company goes out of business, something happens, you need to be able to source those from somewhere else.
Right.
And then are the materials up to the specifications and standards that you need?
Right.
So,
right.
Yep.
Totally understand. I can see how all these controls would really make a difference in the quality of the end products.
This ends part 1 of Design and Development. Please tune in next week when we'll continue our discussion with Norm and cover customer requirements and changes, documentation, moving to production, tech and service companies, and continual improvement in design and development.
And we want to thank everyone who's listened to our podcast today. We hope it's been informative for you. Now, if you're looking for more information about Core Business Solutions and how we can help you with ISO certification, cybersecurity, or even customized training, please email us at info@thecoresolution.com. You can also visit our website at www.thecoresolution.com. And if you haven't already followed us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to do so, or even check us out on YouTube. That way you won't miss the next Quality Hub podcast when it's released next week. Have a great day.